Let me put it this way. There is a chance that we won't finish this interview, that our interview will be cut short by a thermonuclear war. And if it doesn't happen today, it could happen tomorrow or it could happen the next day. The point I'm trying to make is we live in a world where tensions are so high and the threshold for the use of nuclear weapons have been dropped so low on both sides that one mistake, one miscalculation, one misjudgment could lead to a nuclear exchange. And it will not be limited to simply a tactical nuclear weapon dropped in Europe or one dropped in Ukraine or anything. Once it begins, it doesn't end until there's a general nuclear exchange. And it will only take, between 40 minutes to 3 hours for the world to be destroyed. And that's the life everybody, and I want everybody to understand that this is real. If you're listening to this program, your entire life, the future you think you have, could be over that quick. And you're going to ask yourself, well, how did this come about? It sort of snuck up on us. We've been complacent and we've allowed our respective governments, whether it be in the United States, whether it be in Great Britain, whether it be in France, whether it be in Russia, to let the nuclear genie that we were trying to stuff back into the bottle in the 1980s and 90s through arms control, which I played a very important role in. We don't have arms control anymore. We don't have disarmament. All we have is new nuclear employment doctrines that are forward-leaning, and that, like I said before, have lowered the threshold for the use of nuclear weapons to such an extent that nuclear war could happen at any second.
And Scott, let's talk in specifics here, because I think the Biden administration in March 2022, they published, and I'm not an expert on this stuff, so I think it's probably documents which they published on a regular basis, but there were some changes in that in terms of the US's posture on nuclear weapons. What were they, and what are the implications?
There's three documents in particular that are in play here. The first is what's called the Nuclear Posture Review, the NPR. It's something that's done by every administration when they come in. And basically it lays out the overarching nuclear policy of the United States. For instance, President Trump, when he came in, published an NPR that embraced the notion of preemptive nuclear war in a non-nuclear environment, meaning that the United States could launch nuclear weapons anytime we wanted against any target we wanted, if we saw that it represented a national interest. It got so bad that a Trump administration arms control official, in speaking in Washington, D.C., said that it was the goal of the Trump administration to have the Chinese and Russian officials wake up every morning not knowing whether or not this was the day America was going to nuke them. Very dangerous posture. So Joe Biden, in running for office in 2020, said he wants to step away from that and impose what he calls the sole purpose doctrine. That is, the sole purpose of America's nuclear arsenal would be to deter other nations from attacking us with nuclear weapons and to respond decisively if they did attack. He said this is it, rightly so. He said we have to transition away from this other policy because this will lead to nuclear war. We need to embrace this deterrence only posture. And yet when he became president, his nuclear posture review, which he published, just was basically, it continued what the Trump administration had started. Now, the nuclear posture review, though, led to, under the Trump administration, the publication of what's called a nuclear employment, or the president's nuclear employment guidance, that is based upon the posture. He's now telling the military, here's the guidance on how I want you to employ the nuclear weapons we have, what my priorities are, etc. Whether it is deterring Russia, destroying China, something like that. Then the Secretary of Defense takes that guidance and creates an actual war plan. It says, this is how many warheads we will allocate to each problem. This is why. These are the options we have. So what happened when the Biden administration continued the Trump administration's nuclear policy profile, the world had changed, you see, because of the aggressive policies of the United States and the blowback that comes from it. Russia invaded Ukraine. And in doing so, Russia put nuclear weapons on the table. The United States and NATO have responded in a way that have, again, as we spoke earlier, increase the possibility of war, which means we now have to have a war plan ready for the Russians. And so there's so many warheads that you allocate. We have a New START treaty that's in place that caps warheads for deployable warheads for each side at 1,550. And so we have to have our warheads planning to hit the Russians to prevent their warheads from hitting us. We have a war plan to do that. Meanwhile, we've provoked the Chinese, and the Chinese have gone from their 200 nuclear warhead arsenal saying, wait a minute, America can knock all these out and achieve nuclear supremacy over us. We need to change our profile. They built 360 silos. They're going to put about 100 missiles in there, moving them around. DF-41s, 10 warheads each. China's moving to get 1,500 warheads out there. Now, America, Biden is sitting there going, whoa, 1,500 Russian warheads, 1,500 Chinese warheads, and we only have 1,500 American warheads. How do we do this? So a new plan had to be made.
And Scott, can I just ask a question? I mean, how many nuclear weapons is enough? Because surely after a certain number, you might be sort of covering different targets and stuff. But it appears to me, if China have got 1,500 in the future, Russia have got 1,500, America, is that not enough to blow the world up 10 times over?
Back in the 1960s, when America put together its first nuclear war plan called the Single Integrated Operational Plan, the Strategic Air Command said that they could destroy the world with 400 nuclear weapons. The reason why we have so many is that because of the arms race, the vast majority of the warheads that we have are being used to destroy the enemy's missiles. So the more missiles we create, the more targets we create for the enemy, then they have to create more missiles. So we have to create more targets. And so the vast majority of these warheads are going to be targeted against the opponent's nuclear. So now we ask the question, if that's the case, let's just bring it down to 400. And then if that's the case, acknowledging that the destruction of the world isn't what anybody wants, get rid of them all. There's literally no justification for the continued existence of nuclear weapons, none whatsoever.
I mean, that sounds bonkers what you just described there, but I guess that is where we are, isn't it, with the nuclear situation. Now, finally, Scott, when Gilbert Doctorow was on, he did talk about the situation in Russia at the moment and the fact that he's written an article on these JASSM, that's right, missiles. They're air-to-ground missiles that you fire from an F-16. And he was saying that people he's talking to in Russia, serious people, they're very, very concerned and they're very paranoid as well about America's intentions, even to the extent where you've got 2 aircraft carrier and all of the ships that go with that, those 2 fleets in the Mediterranean. And there are people in Russia that are suspicious that they're not there to contain Iran at all, that they're actually there potentially to have a strike on Russian soil. What's your kind of summary of that? And do you agree with his analysis that actually, I think there is a danger that Russia is paranoid and will misinterpret, or maybe it's not misinterpreting what the US intentions are?
Anytime you have 2 nuclear powers that view each other in adversarial fashion, and they have nuclear arsenals that were designed to strike the other, you have a potential for misunderstanding. It's not paranoia. You literally need to have all of your radars out and be alert to any possibility. I remind people of the historical precedent of what was a nuclear exercise that NATO ran in 1984 called Able Archer, I think 83, Able Archer 83. The Russians looked at it and said, it's not a nuclear exercise. You're actually getting ready to launch a preemptive nuclear strike against Russia, against the Soviet Union. So they put their nuclear forces on alert. And one mistake, we would have had a nuclear war in 1983 that would have destroyed the entire globe. Today, we have a situation where the United States has talked with NATO about putting on operational status 20% of our B-61 nuclear bombs, the NATO nuclear deterrent. That means every time an F-35 aircraft takes off from a NATO airfield, because it's a nuclear capable aircraft, the Russians have to assume that there's a B-61 nuclear bomb on board. But we also have talked about having other potential, non-nuclear potential in place that can punish Russia with nuclear-like effect, taking out command and control, etc. So now when you give Ukraine, talk about giving Ukraine deep strike precision guided weapons that can strike Moscow and other places, when you have nuclear arsenals in NATO on alert, when you have aircraft carriers forward deployed, understanding that traditionally the United States has taken carrier battle groups up to the shores of the Soviet Union and Russia and launched aircraft towards them, simulating a strike only to pull away to test the Russian defenses. It's not paranoia for Russia to go 1 + 1 + 1 + 1 + 1 equals a potential of a preemptive strike, which is why Russia has changed its nuclear doctrine as we speak. The deputy foreign minister has announced this. And I agree with Dr. Doctorow here. The Russians have changed their attitude towards nuclear war and their nuclear posture. Russia is leaning towards preemption of its own. They are not going to wait to be struck. If it looks like NATO, the United States, whether directly or through proxy, is going to strike Russia in a way that threatens its national command and control capabilities, Russia will not wait to be attacked. Once Russia believes it's about to be attacked, it will preempt, and it will preempt decisively with nuclear weapons. Boom. Like I said, there's a chance that this broadcast may not end.
Yeah, and finally, we have run out of time now, Scott, but I do want to ask you this. Do you think Russia will interpret, say, for example, if these JSSM missiles are used by Ukraine off F-16s provided by the West, if they're used to strike deep into Russia, will Russia blame Ukraine for that, or will it blame NATO?
Russia's already said it will blame NATO, and I believe that if this happens, that the NATO bases that facilitate the transfer of these weapons will be struck. That is, Poland and Romania will be struck decisively by the Russians, and with potential nuclear escalation coming after that. Like I said, hopefully we're going to get through with this broadcast and we'll dodge that bullet, but that doesn't mean that tomorrow the world doesn't end. We are this close. And if the people don't wake up and start asking questions, demanding answers from their governments, we're this close. We need leadership like Ronald Reagan in the 1980s, a man who was a cold warrior, but a man who sat down with the Soviets and started the process of nuclear disarmament because he recognized that it was insanity to have these weapons and be prepared to use these weapons.
Listen, Scott, I think you're absolutely great. I think you've got loads of insight, really, really valuable insight. And more important, I think your message, which you put out on the show today, is the exact message that we should be putting out to the world. So thank you very much, Scott Ritter, for coming on the Freeman Report today. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
The Freeman Report and James Freeman on today's News Talk Radio, TNT.